today. For some unknown reason, we put community crossing and community corrections on the same day, so I will try to keep them separate when I'm talking about them, but no guarantees. Before we jump into the community crossings grant, we did include in your pack on the presentation material a working draft of the chart of accounts. I put it up here because when I print it out, of course mine doesn't have any colors on it, but it does have colors when you look at it. The ones that are highlighted in green, we're going to be talking about tomorrow when we go over the roundtable on the new lit accounting. So we're not going to talk about those today. The ones in yellow were the new ones, and I did talk about those in the spring that we added for the new legislation. The one underneath those are the blue, and that's what we're going to be talking about this afternoon. And I think there's a few other, some more on back, and they're either yellow or green. So I just want you to be aware of that, and again, you'll need this for tomorrow. On the ones in that are in yellow, again, we talked about those, the 1229 fund, which was the special distribution where you had to account for the at least 75% of your special distribution that was restricted in use. 1230 and 1231, 1230 is specific to Marion County, 1231 to Clark County, and the 1232, which is that law enforcement recordings copy fee. I don't know how useful or how much that will get used. We did include a new one in the settlement funds, which was 6030 on abatement deduction repayment to account for situations where entity is required to repay what abatement they had been given for whatever reason. That's going to have to then be allocated back out to the taxing units, and that's a fund that you can hold that until you make that allocation. We did have a new one come up in just the last couple of weeks. It's not even on this form, but will be when we get the updated one. When we put the updated chart of accounts, it's not going to have all these highlights in it, which is another reason I gave you this, so that you have some idea of what we're talking about when we're doing it, but I'm going to take all of those out. But it did come out, there was one county that had received a fine from a railroad corporation for blocking a railroad grade crossing, and that fine, even though it's an infraction judgment, it does go into a special fund at the state called the Industrial Rail Service Fund. So it's going to be, if that is ever collected, it will be remitted to the auditor, and you will be sending it in at your semi-annual remittance of infraction and judgments, but we put it in a separate fund, the 7119, it's a new one. And that's so that it can be separately identified as this railroad crossing fine so that it can get into the right fund at the state. So just a little update on that. So there is a PowerPoint presentation. It's a very short one, so hopefully this will be a short discussion on the community crossing grant accounting. So again, to bring us all up to date, back in May, there was a special distribution of the Lowett trust balances that were held at the state. Those were basically the balances that were in the fund at 12/31/15 at least. 75% of the distribution was restricted in use, so we established that fund 1229 to account for that receipt. Of course, you could put more than 75% in, but at least 75% had to go in there. The same time, there was also new legislation that introduced a new grant called the Local Road and Bridge Matching Grant Fund. Eventually, this has been named Community Crossings Grant by NDOT, and so that's what most of you are familiar with it now. That's what NDOT is calling it. To be eligible for the grant, one of the requirements was that the local unit had to commit to a local match, It's a 50-50 grant with the state providing 50% for the approved projects, and the local unit must match that with 50% of local income for those same projects. The statute restricted the sources of the local match to revenue attributable to an increase after June 30th, 2016 in the local unit's motor vehicle excise surtax or wheel tax, money received by the local unit as a special distribution of the local income tax, that was in May, and the money in the local unit's rainy day fund. Last spring, when we first talked about this grant, we had said we would not take audit exception to existing money being used to meet your local match, but we were later told that that would not be correct, that NDOT was going to adhere very strictly to the statute and follow exactly for those three sources. If it was not in one of those three locations, they were not going to consider it for the matching grant. I know from talking to several of you, and Shannon has talked to several of you, that the information you're getting from NDOT, that may not be completely accurate in what they're doing, but officially, this is the information we were given, and this is the information we're going with, and this is the information we're auditing the grant against. So we want to make sure we're all clear on that. The problem that arose from them being very strict with that is there were, especially for small towns, but probably some of the smaller counties, they didn't get enough in their special distribution of local income tax. They did not have sufficient money in their rainy day to do all the projects that they would like to do, but did have money in those existing funds and would like to use that money. So we had a work team, members from NDOT, members from BMV, members from State Board of Accounts, all got together to work out a process to allow that money to be shown in rainy day so that it could be considered for the match. As you know, our audit position is that those dedicated funds, MVH, local road and street, major moves, that money is not to be transferred to rainy day. So it was necessary to put precautions in place to protect the purpose of this money and to protect the source of where this money came from, but still allow you the flexibility to get that money in a place that NDOT would consider in granting this community crossings grant. So we issued a memo jointly between State Board of Accounts, well, that's his deal, Jeff. It was BMV and NDOT. And we gave you and presented an accounting for existing funds and in the rainy day fund. So there was a separate identification if you were moving money from local road and street or wheel and surtax, or you were moving money from MVH and major moves. We did not put in the memo, but we did have some communities ask us, or some counties ask us about using Cume Bridge Fund for bridge projects because the Community Crossings Grant is the local road and bridge grant fund. And so we did, on a case-by-case basis, give information to those counties on how they could follow the same precautions, the same procedures to protect the Cume Bridge Fund and still have it considered as part of the matching portion for the grant. And I'll get back to that in a little bit. The only reason we established these rainy day restricted funds was to allow existing road funds to be considered as committed funding for the local match of the new road and bridge grant, or now called Community Crossings Grant. That was the only purpose. We did not intend for this to be a fund for, it is a special restricted portion of your rainy day fund. It is identified as rainy day, but it is not treated the same way as your other remaining balance in your rainy day funds. So we have received a lot of questions on that. And I'm hoping to address most of those, but if we have time, we'll go over them. No, I'm still on that one. Okay. So these are holding funds. That way you can show NDOT that you have sufficient local matching funds to be eligible for the grant. Once the grant has been approved, so you know you're going to be getting the grant, you move your matching portion into a local and state grant that in that 9,000 series that we talked about earlier with community corrections, you're going to set up a community crossings grant fund. You're going to move your local match into that. That does talk about that. So you're going to move it, if it's in one of the rainy day restricted accounts, you're going to move it out of there into the grant fund. If it's in your 1229 fund and you've committed part of that, you're going to move that into the grant fund. The only two places. So you're getting it into the grant fund. When you receive the money from NDOT, you're putting that in the grant fund. So now the grant should at one point contain all of your match, your local match, all of the NDOT money, and that way it tracks all of the receipts and disbursements on that grant. So it's going to have one location to show everything that that grant was spent for. I've listed on here the Indiana code that talks about the state grants. When you receive the state grant and the local grant and moving that money into that fund, which is basically what I've just talked about, but here is the statutory authority for that. And in Part B, you'll note it says, when you complete the project for which the state grant money was provided and money remains in the fund, the political subdivision shall transfer the state share of remaining money to the treasurer of state for deposit in the fund from which the grant was made, and the political subdivision pro rata share of the remaining money reverts back to the general fund. I'm not sure how that's going to affect the community crossings because it is an ongoing grant. So I'm assuming they were going to let you continue to get grant. Every year you can get a new grant. So I'm not sure how much we're going to follow on that, but just so you're aware of that. Okay. So let me go back to that. The money in the grant fund should only be spent on the approved projects identified in your community crossings grant. So it's going to tell you what approved projects are there, and that's what you should be spending the money out of the grant fund on, and that's what you're going to reporting back to NDOT when those projects are completed. Any changes, any cost overruns, underruns, whatever comes up with that, you're going to be reporting back on that, and that's why you want it all in one fund. We have been told, again, that NDOT may not be giving out the same information. I have no way to say. All I know is what we've been told, that they are approving existing disbursements, that you might have already spent money on a project in January through June, and they're going to allow that to be part of your matching. I don't know if that's true or not. If it is, I would get it in writing from NDOT, that specifically what they're approving as part of that local match, because that does not follow the statute about looking for it in those funds and then moving it into the grant fund. So I would get it in writing. Technically speaking, you should, and bear with me on this, you should reverse the disbursements from the account it was made, from the fund it was made out of, move that portion from that fund to the, if it's like MVH, to the restricted rainy day fund, and then into the grant fund, and then repost those disbursements so that all of it is in one fund. We are not going to take audit exception if you do not do that, if you keep it exactly in the fund that it has already been dispersed from. If these are things you spent prior to getting that grant approval and they're going to allow it as part of your grant match, keep the documentation and make sure you have some place you keep it located, because I guarantee at some point someone's going to come back and ask you everything that you spent this grant money on, what was your local match and for the grant. Because it's now not in one fund, if they're allowing that, then when you post your community crossings grant to Gateway, it's going to be missing those existing disbursements they allow to count as your local match. So it is not going to have all of the information, and I'm pretty sure that at some point the legislature or someone are going to be questioning what happened with this community crossings grant. How did it work? How much money was spent? What projects were completed? And if it's not all going to be in Gateway, they're going to be coming back to you as the auditor and saying, where is this information? So make sure you keep track of it. And again, that goes back to what I was saying earlier. That's why we set up the separate grant fund, was to separately identify that. Officially, again, we have not been told that NDOT is doing this. So if your county is an exception to this rule, just make sure you keep all of your documentation together. Some other questions we have received on this. Can you expend the money from the grant fund before there's money in the grant fund? No, you may not. It is an advance grant, so you should not be spending money out of the grant fund until you have some money in it, till it has a cash balance. You can move your local match in even before you receive the money from NDOT, and you can certainly spend your local money out of that grant fund. We have heard, again, I'm not sure that in some situations money has actually been dispersed that would be part of the grant money, so not just the local match, but part of the grant money. If that is the case, and again, keep documentation, that would make it a reimbursable grant and not an advance, which we understand this is supposed to be an advance grant. They're going to give you the money, you pursue the projects. But if you've already paid for the projects and now they're giving you grant money to reimburse your county expenses, then it's a reimbursable grant, and so the rules for reimbursable grants would fall. And remember, a reimbursable grant can be run in the red, but the advance grant funds cannot. So there is a distinction between that. The other questions then that we have been asked, if you move that money into your rainy day restricted accounts, can we spend out of that? No. The money is to hold your matching money until your grant is approved, in which you're going to transfer it to the grant. If it's MVH and major moves and Cume Bridge, which I'll get into a little bit, that money, if it is not used to match your local match for the grant, must go back to your MVH fund or your major moves fund or your Cume Bridge fund, because the statute does not allow that money to go out. It has to stay in the fund at year end. So if you're not using it for your local match, it needs to go back. The local road and street and your wheel and surtax restrict the use, but there is not that same language in the statute that it has to stay in the fund. So you may keep that in your rainy day restricted. However, it is only to be used to meet your local match. So if you've got local road and street that you've got in your rainy day restricted for local road and street, and your highway person wants to use it on a project, they cannot do it out of that fund. There should be no disbursements on projects from the rainy day restricted funds. Either kind of come out of existing highway financing funds, or it's going to come out of the grant fund. Which then goes on to say, underlying that, do not transfer money into a rainy day restricted account that you don't think you need to meet that match, because that's the only reason to put that money in there. Okay. So in a little bit, in addition on the Cume Bridge, there are restrictions in the statute for the use of cumulative bridge funds. They are approved for, you can have bridge projects approved as part of the community crossings grant. If you need these instructions in writing, please let Shannon or I know, and we will send them to you. But basically, you're going to follow similar to the MVH and the major moves. You're going to set up, there is a rainy day restricted fund for Cume Bridge. You're going to move your matching money into that fund. If your grant is approved and includes the bridge project, there's a lot of ifs in there, you are going to transfer the money from the rainy day restricted cumulative bridge into a grant fund for cumulative bridge, a second grant fund, community crossings, bridge projects. Because the cumulative bridge money can only be spent on bridge projects. The grant money can be spent on bridge projects, but the cumulative bridge can only be spent. So it cannot be commingled with the other funds and spent on any other road projects. It has to be spent on the bridge project. So that would require a second fund. And I think that's most of the questions that we have. Does anyone have, I know this has been a thorn in your side for the last few months, so does anyone have any questions over anything I've gone over, or what you're dealing with in your county, or make Shannon run a little bit, because I ran. Vicki has a question way up front, Shannon.
So if you have 3 projects, they're all road projects, would you just have an individual line item in the grant fund for each project, or would you break those down, or?
I think you will probably want to do an individual line for each project, because I think you have to report on each project what the original cost of the project and what you actually spent on each project, so you probably will want them separate.
Right, but you don't need a separate grant for each project,
no,
correct?
The only
Okay.
separate grant is if you have cumulative bridge money involved.
Okay.
Everything else can run
Separate
through
fund,
one.
I mean, yeah, okay.
Just to clarify this for me, the special LOAT money, the 75% that we received was put into a special fund. That was used for paving projects, and that's completed. Then when we submitted it in for community crossings, we submitted 4 projects. One of the 4 projects was the special LOAT, okay? So now we've been approved for those 4 projects. The plan was, from my understanding, when I talked to someone, that the special LOAT will stay where it is. That 800 whatever that we had, that's going to be our match money on our side. Then we're going to have grant for the other 3 projects. That's going to be put into a grant, the state grant, with those 3 projects, with the money from the state, and then the remaining match money will go in there, and that'll take care of those 3 projects, because the first one's totally completed. It's got a great accounting source as it is right now. So I just wanted to have a good accounting source for my other 3 projects. And I was, if I have those 2, you look at both of those for my community crossings grant, and it's all clarified that way.
If everything was paid out of the 1229 fund,
Yes.
you just need to keep documentation that
Yes.
that was part of your local match for the
Yes.
community crossings grant, because they're going to ask about that as well.
And I've got all
but
those
if you've
papers.
already spent it, we will
Okay.
not take exception to you leaving it where it is.
Okay.
But any new projects, you need to move to the grant fund.
Okay, and then the 25% that was left over, we put in rainy day. We're going to use, out of that 25%, our match, the remaining match. So it's
Then
not
that
going to come.
needs to be moved to the grant fund.
Absolutely right, and I have
Yeah.
already done the additional. Perfect, thank you.
Do you need an appropriation to move this, to transfer this money?
You need council approval to transfer it. You need an appropriation to disperse it.
I just want to make sure I'm clear on this. We've been approved. We're supposed to set up a special grant fund and put the local match in it, as well as the community crossing grant money into that. And the only thing it can be used for is the 3 projects that were approved. period.
Now, if there is a balance, and I don't know how that's going to work because it should use up all the money. If there is a balance and they allow you to carry it forward, you could use it on the next year's grant projects.
This is kind of not as important question, but does anyone know when the money's actually coming from the state?
Has anyone received their community crossings grant money yet? Checks in the mail.
Checks in the mail.
Okay, thank you. We got one. Checks in the mail. All right.
Vicki, do you still have a question? Shannon, Vicki had a question. You gonna come up front? Get moving, get moving. Her hand was up first.
You just want me to walk back over there.
Okay, I think this was partially answered. Just to clarify, first off, I do want to thank you guys for helping us because this has been kind of confusing in our county, partly because what our county commissioners wanted to do isn't really allowable, but just to, uh-oh.
Shocking.
Well, they wanted to set up a new rainy day fund that would use major moves monies as well as the Lowett special distribution. So just to clarify this, we should only move the matching money into the new grant fund along with the grant money that we're going to get from the state. Then any other highway or bridge projects that are not being used as part of the local grants should be paid for out of 1129.
Or MVH or local road and street, yeah, out of existing funds. If it's not part of the grant project, because you can do other road projects, you would just pay it like you would normally out of those funds. But I want to make sure that people don't think, well, I put this money in and now I want to use it on a road. You know, you can't disperse out of those rainy day restricted. The grant fund or your existing funds that you already have in place for highway.
Okay. But what if our Lowett special distribution was more than we're going to use for the matching grant?
Then you would disperse directly from the Lowett, this 1229 fund for any projects that you want to
Okay.
spend it on.
Okay, very good.
And then when we're asking you to account for that Lowett special distribution, you can say, here's the money we spent on existing, here's what we put in our local road and bridge grant matching, and it identifies all of that.
Okay, and we can transfer the matching grant fund into the new grant fund even before we receive the grant, as
Yes.
long as we've received notice that we're going to get the grant.
Right, and then you
Verbal
can
notice.
spend it because you're waiting on the NDOT to come in with
Okay.
their money.
Great, thank you.
So then we have the appropriations in 1229, and that's our match money, and we're spending out of that right now. So before, and it's an appropriation, so before we can change that to the grant money, then we need a special resolution from the county council in order to move
transfer it, yes.
to move it over there. But
Right.
we don't have to move it over there. We can continue to spend from there and the other fund.
You can spend out of that on road projects if it's not part of your
It's
grant.
part of our match.
Then it has to be moved over.
Okay. Then what happens next year? Is it the same thing? I mean, do we get the special distribution?
I know they're in talks about clearing up this whole process.
Uh-huh.
And so the legislators are looking at that, so I can't be 100% sure, but I think it's going to be easier next year. I'm hoping.
But we'll still get the special distribution and go through some kind of a process?
No, the special distribution, that anytime that your trust balances at the state exceed 15%, they are going to distribute that. But there's not necessarily going to be a restriction on that. It may go back to the way it was before, where they're just giving you the excess balances and you use them the way you
Okay.
use your other local income tax.
All right, thank you.